My parents stole my college fund to pay for my brother's influencer career. They called me a bad investment. Today my brother is in jail and they need lawyer fees. I replied I only invest in winners. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. My father, Stephen, had called me screaming for $60,000 in bail money, desperate and frantic, but my pulse didn't spike. My hands didn't shake. I simply reviewed the mental spreadsheet of our relationship, realized the account was overdrawn, and waited for him to realize the power had finally shifted. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The air conditioning in my Scottsdale home office hummed a low, steady note, the only sound in the room until my father's voice shattered the peace. Through the phone, I could hear the chaos in the background, police radios shouting, maybe even Logan sobbing. It was a cacophony of failure, loud and messy, invading the pristine silence I had spent 5 years building. I looked around my desk. Everything was in its place. My dual monitors displayed rows of perfectly balanced data, quarterly projections for a client who valued precision over personality. A ceramic coaster held my iced coffee condensation beating on the glass but never touching the mahogany. This room was a temple to order, and on the other end of the line my father Stephen was trying to burn it down. "Morgan, are you listening to me?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a panic I hadn't heard since I was 18. "They're processing him right now. The bail is set at $60,000. We need a retainer for the lawyer, too. You have to wire it. Today. Right now." I didn't answer immediately. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was cold, bitter, and grounding. "Did you hear me?" he screamed. "Your brother is in a holding cell. He's scared, Morgan. He's just a kid." "He is 24 years old, Dad," I said. My voice was level, stripped of any inflection. It wasn't the voice of a daughter. It was the voice of an auditor, finding a discrepancy in the ledger. "He isn't a kid. He is a grown man who committed wire fraud." "It was a misunderstanding," my father insisted, the desperation making him slur his words. "The haters reported him. It's all going to be cleared up, but we need to get him out first. We don't have the liquidity right now, you know that. But you do. We know you do." There it was. The entitlement. The assumption that my resources were merely a backup server for their crashed system. They didn't know I had the money because I flaunted it. They knew because they assumed that since I didn't spend it on leased Lamborghinis or trips to Dubai, it must be sitting there waiting for them to claim it. I looked at the spreadsheet on my left monitor. It was my personal net worth tracker. It showed the compounding interest of my savings, the steady growth of my index funds. It represented thousands of hours of boring, unglamorous work. Data entry, forensic accounting, late nights finding the missing decimals that everyone else missed. It was a fortress I had built brick by brick to keep people like them out. "I am not wiring $60,000, I said. What the word came out as a gasp. "Morgan, this is your brother. He could go to prison." "Then he should have thought about that before he sold fake courses to teenagers," I replied. "I don't have $60,000 for bail, Dad. I have $60,000 for my future." "Those are two very different line items. You selfish, ungrateful little—" "I am hanging up now," I said, cutting him off. "Do not call me again unless you are ready to apologize. Don't you dare hang." I tapped the red icon on my screen. The screaming stopped instantly. The silence rushed back in, cool and heavy. I stared at the phone for a moment, waiting for the guilt to hit me. I waited for the somatic response, the shaking hands, the tears, the urge to call back and fix it. But the data didn't support that reaction. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was slow. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the disappointment. I felt like the CEO of my own life, and I had just fired a toxic client. I turned back to my monitors, typed a command, and went back to work. The silence in my office was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts of a conversation from 4 years ago, the day I realized my family viewed me not as a person, but as a hedge fund they could liquidate whenever the market got tough. I was 23 years old, standing in the lobby of a bank with a piece of paper that made no sense. I had gone to withdraw the tuition for my final year of grad school. I had been saving since I was 16, working summer jobs, tutoring, and hoarding birthday checks. The account should have held $102,000. Instead, the balance read $42.16. I didn't scream. Screaming is an inefficient use of energy when the damage is already irreversible. I remember feeling a cold clinical detachment like a surgeon looking at an X-ray of a terminal tumor. I drove home to my parents' house, the paper folded neatly in my pocket. I found them in the living room. Logan was there too, scrolling on his phone, ignoring the tension in the room. "Where is it?" I asked. I didn't have to specify what it was. My mother, Susan, didn't even look up from her magazine. We had to make a strategic move, Morgan. We transferred the assets. Assets, I repeated. That was my education. That was my life. It was family money, my father said, standing up to loom over me. And we invested it where it would get the highest return. Look at your brother. I looked at Logan. He was wearing a designer hoodie that probably cost more than my first car. Outside in the driveway sat a leased Ferrari that he couldn't drive because he didn't know how to drive stick shift. Logan is building a brand, my father continued, his voice full of a pride he had never wasted on me. He needs capital to scale. The car, the trips, the followers, it takes money to make money. He's going to be the next big thing. Millions, Morgan. Millions. You spent my tuition on bot followers and a rental car, I said, the math horrifyingly simple. It's an investment, my mother snapped. And what were you going to do with it? Get another degree, data science. It's boring, Morgan. It's slow money. You're playing it safe. Then my father delivered the line that I had engraved on my heart like a tombstone. He looked me in the eye with a pity that burned worse than hatred, and said, "We bet on the horse that's going to win. You're safe, honey. But in this economy, safe is a bad investment." I stood there, and for years I wondered why I didn't walk out the door right then and never look back. Why did I stay? Why did I finish my degree on student loans? Why did I keep coming to Christmas dinner? It wasn't because I was weak. It was because of the invisible chain of the survivor. When you grow up in a house of chaotic dreamers, you become the designated survivor. You convince yourself that your stability is the only thing keeping the roof from collapsing on everyone's heads. I thought that if I stayed, if I kept being the boring, reliable, solvent daughter, I could act as the anchor. I thought my silence was the price of their survival. I told myself that my endurance was a form of love. I wore that responsibility like a heavy chain, thinking it was keeping us all connected. But sitting in my office today with $60,000 safely in my account and my brother in a cell, I finally saw the truth. I wasn't their anchor. I was their insurance policy. They didn't appreciate the stability I offered. They resented it right until the moment they needed to cash it in. They thought the chain was unbreakable. They thought I would always be there to absorb the cost of their delusions. But they forgot the most basic rule of investing past performance is not indicative of future results. And today, the market had finally crashed. The silence from my phone didn't last long. It couldn't. Denial is a powerful drug, but reality has a way of kicking down the door, and my family's reality was currently wearing handcuffs. First came the texts, a barrage of them lighting up my phone like a slot machine hitting a jackpot of guilt. "Mom, I can't believe you're doing this. He's your brother. Dad, we sacrificed everything for you. Is this how you repay us, by letting your family rot, Mom? People are talking, Morgan." What do we tell them? That our daughter is a traitor. I didn't reply. Engaging with spam only confirms the email address is active. I just archived the messages into a folder labeled Evidence. Then came the flying monkeys. That afternoon, my Aunt Linda called my office line. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, not since she told me at Thanksgiving that I lacked vision because I wouldn't invest in her essential oils pyramid scheme. "Morgan," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "your mother called me in tears. She says you're refusing to help Logan. Honey, you have to understand. He's an artist. He's a creator. People like him. They need support from people like us. The steady ones." "He committed wire fraud, Aunt Linda," I said, typing an email while I spoke. "He sold a course on passive income that didn't exist to 500 people. That's not art. That's theft." "It's a misunderstanding," she snapped. "Just like when Steve Jobs got fired from Apple. Genius is always persecuted. And honestly, it's not very becoming of you to be so jealous. Just because Logan shines a little brighter doesn't mean you have to put out his light." I hung up on her too. But the real escalation happened 2 days later. I walked out of my office building to find my parents standing by my car. They weren't there to apologize. They were there to ambush. My mother looked frantic, her designer sunglasses pushing back perfectly highlighted hair that they definitely couldn't afford. My father looked furious, his face red, veins bulging in his neck. "You blocked us," my mother accused, stepping into my personal space. "We have been calling you for 48 hours. "Because I gave you an answer," I said, unlocking my car. "The answer was no." "You don't get to say no," my father shouted, slamming his hand on the roof of my sedan. A few people in the parking lot turned to look. "We invested everything in him. Everything. Do you know what happens if he goes to prison? The brand dies. The sponsorships, the potential deals, it all goes to zero." "It's already at zero, Dad," I said, looking him in the eye. "It was never real. The followers were bots. The sponsorships were fake. He was bleeding money. That's a lie, my mother screamed. He just needed a longer runway. He was this close to breaking through. If you had just supported him 4 years ago, if you hadn't been so selfish with that college fund, he would be a millionaire by now. This is your fault, Morgan. You starved his dream. I looked at them, really looked at them, and I saw something that chilled me more than their anger. I saw genuine belief. It wasn't just lying. It was a complete psychological break. They had poured every dollar, every hope, every ounce of their identity into the idea that Logan was special and I was the resource. To admit that Logan was a criminal was to admit that they had bet their entire lives on a lie. They had stolen from their daughter to fund a fraud. If they acknowledged that the weight of their own failure would crush them, they were trapped in a sunk cost fallacy so deep it had become their reality. They couldn't turn back now. They had to double down. They had to believe I was the villain, because if I wasn't, then they were the monsters. You have savings, my father demanded, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. I know you do. You live in a small house. You drive this sensible car. You hoard it. Liquidate your portfolio. Sell the house if you have to. Family sacrifices for the dream. My dream, I said softly, is to never be like you. I got into my car and locked the doors. As I drove away, I watched them in the rearview mirror, two people standing in an empty parking lot, screaming at a car that was already gone, still waiting for a payout that was never coming. The drive home from that parking lot was the last time I let myself feel angry. Anger is a volatile emotion. It clouds judgment and leads to mistakes. I didn't need anger anymore. I needed clarity. I needed to do what I did best, forensic analysis. I went straight to my home office and locked the door. I didn't turn on the warm lamp I usually used for evening reading. I turned on the overhead lights, the stark clinical LEDs that banished every shadow. I sat down at my desk, cracked my knuckles, and opened a fresh browser window. I stopped looking at them as my parents. I stopped looking at Logan as my brother. I treated them exactly like I would treat a distressed company suspected of embezzlement. I was no longer a daughter grieving a relationship. I was an auditor conducting an autopsy. I started with the public records. Logan's arrest wasn't a secret anymore. The indictment had been unsealed that morning. I paid the fees to access the federal court database and downloaded the 80-page document. As I read, the picture shifted from pathetic to horrifying. It wasn't just wire fraud. It was a classic Ponzi scheme wrapped in the glossy packaging of influencer lifestyle coaching. Logan had been selling equity in his personal brand, promising investors a 20% monthly return based on his future ad revenue. But there was no ad revenue. The sponsorships were fake. The brand deals were fabricated in Photoshop. I scrolled down to the section detailing the flow of funds. The dates caught my eye. They were familiar. Too familiar. The scheme had started 4 years ago. The exact same month my parents had told me my college fund was gone. I pulled up my old bank statements, the ones I had saved from that day in the lobby when my world fell apart. I cross-referenced the date of the withdrawal, $102,000, with the timeline in the indictment. The transfer from my education fund happened on August 12th. On August 14th, Logan's LLC made its first dividend payout to 3 early investors. My stomach turned over cold and heavy. They hadn't stolen my money to buy him a car. Not at first. They had stolen my money to pay off the first wave of victims. My college tuition had been the seed capital for a criminal enterprise. But the indictment had more. It listed unindicted co-conspirators. It described 2 individuals who had hosted wealth seminars in their living room, who had used their community standing to vouch for Logan's genius, who had aggressively recruited friends, neighbors, and church members to invest their retirement savings into the next big thing. I didn't need to guess who they were. I found the LLC registration documents for Logan's shell company. They're listed as managing partners were Stephen and Susan. My breath hitched. They weren't just delusional parents enabling a spoiled child. They were active participants. They were recruiters. They had looked their friends in the eye and sold them a lie, knowing the only money coming in was stolen from their own daughter. Everything made sense now. The desperation in my father's voice, the ambush in the parking lot, the demand for me to liquidate my assets. They weren't just trying to bail Logan out of jail. They were trying to buy his silence. They were trying to hire a legal team powerful enough to keep the investigation from expanding to them. They weren't terrified for their son. They were terrified for themselves. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the truth I had been too close to see. They had called me a bad investment because I offered slow, steady returns in a world where they were addicted to the high of the con. I was the control group in their experiment of greed, and now that the lab was burning down, they needed my fire extinguisher. I printed the documents, the indictment, the LLC registration, the timeline of the transfers. I stacked them neatly on my desk. It was a paper trail of betrayal, precise and undeniable. My phone buzzed again. It was my father. He wasn't screaming this time. He sent a text, "Please, Morgan. We can explain. Just come over. We need to figure this out as a family." I looked at the stack of papers. I wasn't going over there to figure anything out. I was going over there to close the account. The house I had grown up in looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was because I had spent the last 5 years expanding my world, while my parents had spent them shrinking theirs into a fortress of delusion. I pulled into the driveway. My father's sedan was there, looking neglected. The landscaping was overgrown. The appearance of wealth they had prioritized over my education was starting to crack literally and metaphorically. I didn't knock. I still had a key, a relic from a time when I thought I was welcome here. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was quiet, too quiet. It smelled stale, like old coffee and anxiety. "In here," my father's voice called from the living room. It wasn't the booming voice of the man who had demanded $60,000 over the phone. It was thin and reedy. I walked into the living room. They were sitting on the beige sectional that used to be off-limits to children. My mother was clutching a tissue, her eyes red-rimmed. My father was slumped forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. They looked up when I entered. For a second I saw a flash of the old arrogance in my father's eyes, the reflex to dominate. "You came," he said, trying to square his shoulders. "Good. We need to move fast," the lawyer said, "if we can get a retainer to him by." "Stop!" I didn't shout. I didn't have to. I dropped the stack of papers onto the coffee table. The thud echoed in the room. "What is this?" my mother asked, reaching for the top sheet. "That is the indictment," I said. "And the LLC registration. And the bank transfer records." My father went pale. He didn't reach for the papers. He knew what they were. "Morgan, my mother," started, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. It got out of hand. We just wanted to help him. We just wanted—" "You wanted to get rich quick," I finished for her. "And you used my future as the down payment." "We did it for the family," my father exploded, standing up. "Do you think I wanted to work until I died? Logan was our ticket out. He was going to take care of us. He was going to take care of you." "I took care of myself," I said. "I built a life without stealing from anyone. And you called me a bad investment." "You were a bad investment," he shouted, his face twisting. "You were safe. You were boring. You were never going to be famous. You were never going to put our name on a building. We needed a winner, Morgan. Not an accountant." "And look where that got you," I said, gesturing to the papers. "Your winner is in a cell, and you are about to join him." My mother let out a sob. "Morgan, please. We can't go to jail. We're your parents. You have to help us. You're the smart one. You always know how to fix things." The irony was suffocating. Now suddenly my intelligence wasn't boring. Now my stability wasn't a lack of vision. Now I was the smart one. I was the fixer. "I can't fix this," I said. "And I wouldn't if I could." "You ungrateful," my father started, stepping toward me. "I am not ungrateful," I said, holding my ground. "I am grateful. You taught me the most important lesson of my life. You taught me that value isn't about flash. It isn't about hype. It isn't about pretending to be something you're not." I looked at them, really looked at them, two people who had spent their lives chasing an illusion and were now standing in the ruins of their reality. "I only invest in winners," I said, repeating the words that had started this war. "And you two have lost everything." I turned around and walked to the door. "Morgan," my mother screamed. "If you walk out that door, you are dead to us." I paused with my hand on the knob. I looked back one last time. "I was dead to you 4 years ago," I said. "This is just the funeral." I walked out and closed the door. As I walked to my car, I heard the wail of sirens in the distance getting closer. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Logan pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering in exchange for a lighter sentence, though lighter still meant 4 years in a federal facility. My parents weren't so lucky. Because they had recruited investors, friends, church members, neighbors, the prosecutors were less inclined to offer deals. They were indicted on multiple counts of conspiracy and securities fraud. Their assets were frozen, their home was seized, and their reputation, the only currency they actually cared about, was devalued to zero. I didn't go to the sentencing. The court transcripts provided all the data I needed without the emotional overhead. It's been 6 months since I walked out that door. I'm sitting on my patio now, watching the sun set over the desert. My phone is on the table, face up, silent. No frantic calls, no demands for bail, no accusations of being selfish. Just the quiet hum of a life that belongs entirely to me. I think a lot about that final insult, bad investment. It haunts me not because it hurts, but because it reveals exactly how hollow they were. There is a psychological concept called the illusion of power of an empty wallet. My parents spent their entire lives trying to have rather than be. They thought that if they leased the right cars, wore the right logos, and posted the right photos, they became important. They rented their authority. They financed their dignity. But power that is bought on credit is just a vulnerability waiting to be exposed. When the money ran out, they didn't just lose their lifestyle. They lost their selves. They crumbled because there was no foundation underneath the facade. They were empty shells, held together by debt and delusion. I look at my life now. It isn't flashy. I drive a sedan that is 5 years old. I live in a house that is comfortable, not a mansion. My work is tedious to some, invisible to others, but it is real. My net worth isn't a projection based on future scams. It is a calculation of hard work and discipline. They called me boring. They called me safe. They thought those were insults. But sitting here in the peace I paid for, I realized they were wrong. Boring is just another word for freedom. Safe is just another word for sleeping through the night without worrying about the FBI knocking on your door. I invested in myself. I invested in integrity. I invested in the slow, unglamorous process of building a character that can survive a crash. My brother and parents chased the wind and ended up with nothing. I stayed on the ground, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And as the stars come out over the desert, clear and bright, I know the truth. I didn't just survive them. I outperformed them. Have you ever had to cut off someone who saw you as a resource instead of a person? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one.